Dear God in heaven, we thank you for the privilege of being able to meet together, even though we're all spread around in such a large distance. It's truly a blessing to be able to be a church family and come together on these holy Sabbath days. We thank you for this opportunity, and we do ask for a special blessing on each one. And each of our families. We ask that you'll please be with me as I go through this study, and I pray that it will be a blessing for those who are hearing. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so this morning I'm just let me open up a file. Sorry, I should have had that open. However, won't be 1 second. Here we go. Right. Yes, so thank you for being patient. So this morning, I'm sort of continuing on from a little bit from a presentation that I did in February, and I was looking at politics and the influences in society that are shaping politics for us today. So I'll just do a very quick review and then continue on with the direction that I'm heading today. So today's presentation, I'm calling it The Impact of Institutions on Culture. I actually started out looking at it in reverse, as in the impact of culture on institutions. And then looking at recent presentations by Elder Parminder and other teachers, it's obvious that we tend to focus a lot on individuals when we are needing, as a movement, to really start to see things more from the perspective of institutions. And this is a really important point for where we are on the line and in history. So that got me thinking, well, I really need to switch my focus, because I do this a lot. I find myself doing it a lot, where I'm focusing a lot on individuals and not necessarily understanding or focusing on the institutions. And I'm sure I'm not alone. And I think with a conservative Seventh-day Adventist background, this is what we've been really accustomed to doing. So if we can keep that in mind as I'm going through today, keeping in mind that culture and institutions do impact each other. However, we need to really be mindful of how we're looking at that. So it's all about perspective, really. And I think also when we look at this and we're looking at institutions and governments, and we're going through all the studies that that Elder Parminder has and the other teachers have been doing, we're seeing how, actually I forgot I've got to connect this, we're seeing how okay, my train of thought just went. Hopefully I'll get that back in a second. Okay, I'll just go backwards. It'll come back as I'm going through what I was. Oh, I know what I was going to say now. So we've been looking at understanding what is relevant in the context of a bad government versus a good government, and we're looking at that. I believe to understand better God's government versus Lucifer's proposed government at the time, and how that's been playing out in in the earth or in with humanity and the great controversy. So my previous presentation was prompted by Vesper's presentation of Elder Tess from the 21st of May in 2022. And it happened to be done on the day that the Australians was going to the polls in a federal election. And it turned out that the election on that day was the lowest in modern history of turnout for voters, which is significant in Australia because of the fact that Australia has a system where it's actually illegal to not vote. So for there to be such a high proportion of people who chose not to vote under the circumstances was significant. And it basically, at the time, it was Morrison against Albanese, Liberal against Labor. Scott Morrison had been in power, and it was really the, I suppose, unpopularity of Scott Morrison that impacted Australia to vote for Anthony Albanese at the time. So it wasn't so much that Albanese won as much as it was that Morrison lost. And I think that was an interesting situation. The other thing that I was looking at, and Elder Tess also brought this up, the fact that Labor has been moving further right in their policies. And I think we've seen that more recently as well. It's even more obvious that they've been moving more to the right, away from their more centrist position. And in that process also we can see, and I mentioned, we went through this in my last presentation, of the rise of Pauline Hanson and One Nation and how much more popular they're becoming. And even though that wasn't a big thing in 2022, it's certainly just become very significant in more recent times. And in February, it was obvious that One Nation was growing in popularity. And certainly since then, it's only continued to go up in popularity. So it's a populist form of government. Pauline Hanson's more of a populist, very similar in lots of ways to Trump. There are articles which compare her as Australia's version of Trump, and I think there are a lot of common ideologies behind that, which is very concerning. But it's interesting to just see the correlation between the US and Australia. So today I'm not going to be looking as much on Australia's politics. Instead, what I'm hoping to do, although what I will do first is I'll just share my screen and just show a recent Morgan poll, just because it shows, let's just do that. Sharing my screen, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to share my screen with my digital board as well, which I should have checked first, which I didn't, so I hope that's not going to be a problem. So I'll just share my screen. So I'll need, there we go, okay. So this was a Morgan poll, which was, hold on, let me just get rid of, things are popping up. So basically, this is just talking about the rise or fall of popularity with different political parties. By far, the Liberal coalition has dropped over time, and even though Labor is also losing in their, well, actually, if you have a look, they've dropped 2% to 27.5%. That's a huge downturn. And then you've got the Liberal coalition, which is almost as bad. That's 1% down to 23%. And then we've got, the Liberals are unchanged. The coalition has dropped. The Liberals is unchanged. Nationals are 2% down 1%. And then One Nation's increased. So that's significant. And then you've got the Greens are up a little as well, which is a good thing, I guess. And this is a recent poll. So obviously when it says it's up by 1%, that doesn't look like a big increase. But when you look at the 25.5%, from 1% to that, then you can see that's quite a big swing. Other parties have been unchanged. But you've also got the Greens that are up as well. And so independents, not really changed all that much. So I'm just going to stop that screen share for a minute and go back. Okay. So what's actually what I want to look at today is taking a closer look at understanding how this political climate has developed in regard to society, culture, and the impact of those things. So, and just a little bit of a review as well on the trying to weave in some of the new information we've been getting through the presentations from the teachers. So I'm just going to see if my iPad will behave itself. That's what I thought. Okay, great. Okay, let's allow that. And screen mirroring. Let me just fix that. I apologise for the delay. That's not what I meant. I meant to do. There we go. Let's try that. Okay. So looking at what Elder Parminder has been teaching recently, we saw that we're trying to understand the transition of between the sixth and the seventh kingdom. And I'm just going to put that way. Here we go. And Elder Parminder drew a diagram on the board. So I'm going to try to replicate. And he was explaining that the sixth. Oh, okay. Excuse me 1 second. I believe you can't see my board. Is that correct?
Yes.
You can't? Yeah, that's correct.
See your board.
Okay, because I can see it, so that's good, isn't it? Let me just see if I can fix that again. I don't know why that's doing that. I apologise again for that confusion. Here we go. I chose the wrong thing. So I'm hoping this will work. Now, can someone confirm you can see it?
Yes, we can see your board.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm just going to try to, as I said, redraw what Elder Parminder drew, just to explain the transition, because Elder Parminder went through to explain the fact that a transition in kingdoms from one kingdom to another isn't just something that happens overnight. It's a process that can take years, so quite a period of time. So what we see when we're looking prophetically, it depends a little bit on what we're looking for and what we're trying to explain, as to whether we see it at a particular waymark or not. And we've got the sixth kingdom, and it's moving over to the seventh kingdom. And if we are looking at these waymarks, we've got the formalisation, we have the Sunday law, and then we have the close of probation. So what we've got then is the sixth kingdom. We can often just say, okay, so it goes along, and then at the Sunday law, it changes and it becomes the seventh kingdom. So let's just do this. So there is that view that we can see, and that's probably what I'm going to use today. But we also know that there's an element where it really did end back here at the formalisation. And we can also see that there's a perspective where when it ended, we had the seventh kingdom was beginning. So we can see that perspective. And then there is a third perspective where the sixth will continue to in some form through to that final probation point. And then we have the seventh kingdom continues on through to the second advent. So there's this perspective. So as I said, for the most part, what I'm looking at is a simplified version of that, which is just Sunday law, and we've got the transition from the sixth to the seventh kingdom. And we're looking at that in the context of understanding the basically the change in the kingdom, the change in the political landscape, culture, etc. So, as I say, we can say that the sixth was the lamb, and we say this was good, and we see that the seventh is the dragon, and we say this is bad, even though we know that kingdoms always start good, and initially when it was starting, that dragon was good. We saw that when we saw Biden as the first of the seventh, moving on through to when we had Trump re-elected as the seventh. And we also saw Trump as the final. So we saw Trump here as the last, and we saw Biden here as the first of this kingdom. So as I say, this is the simple view. And obviously, if you're looking at the recent presentations, you'll see a much more comprehensive explanation. Now, the thing that I want to ask, though, and can I ask this question? Did the sixth kingdom achieve its goal? Did it do its job? Can someone tell me the answer to that?
I'd say no.
Yeah. Okay, that's correct. They didn't do their job. They failed at their job. They were a good government or a good institution, biblically or prophetically speaking. It doesn't mean they never did anything wrong. It just means from the institution's perspective and Bible prophecy, it was good, but they did fail in their job. And as a result, that contributed to how things started to develop in relation to that seventh kingdom being able to take over. So I wanted to have a little look. I'm going to stop my screen share of this for the moment, and I want to have a look at, let me just, I'm going to share my screen again, a different one. Yeah, okay. Actually, I've got a feeling that okay. So I'm looking at okay, that's not what I was meaning to do. Sorry. What I'll do is this. This will work. Okay, so we were talking about what makes a good and a bad government, and I'm talking about the United States of America being a democratic government, but it's a democratic republic. We know it's the common saying that the government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And you could say that's the definition of a good government, because if you have a look, for the people, which is what the definition of a good government is, the ultimate purpose of government is to protect the rights, promote the general welfare, and serve the public good. So when we look at good and bad governments, a bad government serves themselves. A good government serves the people. And this is a very important aspect. And looking at the USA, it's a democratic republic. It's a form of government that operates both a democracy and a republic. Now, power rests with the citizens who elect representatives to govern on their behalf. And this is the democracy aspect. And then a framework governed by a constitution with no ruling monarch, which is the republic aspect. So they vote for representatives who will be in government to look after their interests. And the core principles I've just listed here: sovereignty is held by the people rather than an hereditary monarch, and state affairs are public matters managed by elected officials who are bound by foundational sets of laws, which is a constitution. And the democracy is power is exercised directly or indirectly by the people through free and fair voting, and it allows eligible citizens to participate in that political process. So in reality, this system, like I said before, in America, it's not compulsory to vote. So therefore, it's up to people as to whether they want to vote or not. And if you get a lot of people out to support one side or the other, then you're more likely to have that side get in. So motivating your voting base is really critical to whether you will be able to get into power. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. So that's how it's supposed to function. However, things have changed. And Elder Parminder brought out how in since 9/11, there's been external emergencies that have led to the powers of the presidency, the seat of power, to basically implement more old laws that were relevant more at the beginning of the glorious land in the 18th century to what it is now. And those laws were brought about due to these emergencies, one of them being 9/11 in 2001. These are the ones that were discussed. They may have other things that have contributed as well. But the other two was COVID and also the war in Ukraine. Now, it's important to note that this all happened during the rule, for want of a better word, of the Sixth Kingdom. It was the Sixth Kingdom that increased these presidential powers. And as Elder Parminder has explained, this is what made that seat of power more attractive to the bad woman. And it was then that the bad woman and also those who are using that bad woman in order to, like the GOP, basically were able to then take advantage of those powers, which is partly why the Seventh Kingdom has become what it is. Now, we also saw Elder Parminder's been recommending people to go back and review the studies that were done in 2016. I think he said 2015, but I've got a feeling it might be 2016. Anyway, in that vicinity of the movement did some studies on the last president and identified Donald Trump as being the last president. However, at the time, we didn't understand that it was the last president of the Sixth Kingdom as opposed to just the last president ever. And consequently, we've come to understand those studies better, and he's encouraged us to go back and review them. So we see that, as I mentioned, the Sixth Kingdom failed in its job. It didn't fail in everything. It was looking after the people, and things were progressing to some degree. However, they just didn't look after the people enough, or enough to cause discontent, in the population, in society. So people in general were unhappy with government. This meant that, the more distrusting they became of government, the more they looked for problems to reinforce their opinions already. So society, just because it's made up of people who are human beings, becomes susceptible then to misinformation and disinformation. And Elder Tess identified these as being very relevant to be able to use to influence the population in regards to who they would potentially vote for. And of course, there were powers that were being put in place, or powerful people were being put in place from, I believe she went back to even 2014 to show what sort of events were happening at that Sunday law of the priests that would reflect the Sunday law of the 144,000 on the main line. And we saw that there were changes being put in place to the Republican Party that would literally change it forever. They were getting rid of people who wouldn't basically toe the new party line. And they were setting things up in a way that would really enable that Seventh Kingdom to do what it's now doing. Obviously, we need to not just keep looking at all these things through moral glasses. And we use the terms bad and good, but not specifically for individuals, even though we can go through and identify individuals that we could maybe say are bad or good, morally speaking. But we really want to get away from that so much and look at the institutions, the group, and how the the good is just really talking about looking after the people, and bad is talking about looking after themselves. So just to reiterate that. So I want to have a little look at a couple, like some terms that we are familiar with. And one of them is society. So if I share my screen again. So society, I think we all really know what a society is, but I want to connect these terms so that we can see how they all work in regards to what we're looking at. A society is a large organised group of individuals who share the same geographical territory, political authority, and cultural expectations. And it functions through persistent interactions, shared institutions, and collective norms that allow people to coexist, cooperate, and work toward common goals. So that's the definition of society. And we can see that it talks here that about in the definition about functioning through persistent interactions, shared institutions, and collective norms. And these work towards common goals. So keep that in mind, because culture is the other word I want to look at. Culture refers to the shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviours, artefacts that characterise a group or society. It is the collective way of life passed down through generations, encompassing everything from language and religion to food, art, and social norms. And to understand these 5 key elements of culture. And every culture is built upon a foundation of 5 interconnected components. And I've just highlighted here a point that in the movement, we're cultivating a culture of collectivism, not individualism. And I thought that was interesting because it says here, values and beliefs, the guiding principles and convictions about what is true, right, and important. It's individualism versus collectivism. And so this is what I believe we're cultivating at the moment. The unspoken rules, norms, unspoken rules, traditions, expected behaviours that govern daily life and interactions. And we've got language, the primary system of communication, both spoken and non-verbal, that allows a society to share ideas and preserve its heritage. So these are important aspects of culture. Symbols, physical or abstract representations such as flags, gestures, or monuments that hold specific meaning for a group, and rituals, ceremonies, or repeated practices that mark important life events, transitions, and shared traditions. I think in Australia we can see when we consider Indigenous cultures in Australia and how they are aiming to maintain their culture. They don't want to lose their culture. And you can see how all these things, these five points are really relevant. So I just have a question. Can someone remind us what Elder Tess taught about culture? Can anyone? I'm sure you can remember. So if someone wants to remind us, otherwise I will.
Lynne, do you mean in the context of
Sorry, go ahead.
Just in the context, do you mean in the way of what's sacred to us?
Okay. I probably didn't explain that very. And yes, that's a good point. But what I was thinking of was she was seeing that culture replaced something in society because yes, church. Did you say?
Yes, Lynne.
Yes. So religion, church, that's right, exactly. So, and thank you, Rachel. That's a really good point too. I just didn't really specify my question very well. So religion, Deborah says in the chat as well. That's correct. So Elder Tess was talking about how, as Adventists, we were very focused on church, religion, and we didn't really understand just how much culture impacted our day-to-day lives and our beliefs, even as religious people. And there was it was so important that it was not religious differences that caused our split, our large split in 2019 within the movement. It was literally culture, the differences in culture, because once someone's culture is threatened or, challenged, then that creates quite a divide. You can't, as it says, you can't walk together unless they be agreed. And I think it's kind of talking about culture in that sense. So just to share my screen again. I've got culture is the shared way of life for a group of people, including language, food, and social habits. And religion is a specific system of faith, worship, and spiritual belief. And it's actually included in that. It's sort of like a subset of culture. But religion has been dying down. And even for those, if we're looking at the glorious land, even for those who are quite religious still, their culture is really what's driving them, despite their profession of religion. So how do these two things, religion and culture, differ? They can differ in scope, foundation, evolution, and adherence. We don't have to look at that in depth, but you can see that culture is broad and it encompasses all the aspects of human life, daily life. Religion is a very specific component. It's a subset or influence within culture. Culture is created by human beings over time through shared experiences and geography. Religion is traditionally based on divine revelation or sacred texts, etc., and a relationship with a higher power. Evolution is culture is fluid, constant. How did it evolve, basically? Culture is fluid, constantly evolving, adaptable to modern societal changes. And the core fundamentals and tenets of a religion are traditionally fixed and absolute. And this is an important point because it's the fact that culture can be influenced and changed in some respects more easily than religion can, because it's impacted in a much more broad fashion and can be changed over time. Religion tends to stick with its original rules. Adherence, you participate in culture simply by being a part of society. Religion, however, requires personal beliefs and conscious alignment with a specific doctrine. So we can see that, I'm sure. So where they actually do intersect, in other words, where they're similar, mutual influence. Religion deeply shapes culture, influencing traditional clothing, art, moral codes and holidays, dietary restrictions, talks about Islam and Judaism. Expression, religious practices are often carried out through local cultural expressions, meaning the exact same religion can look slightly different depending on where in the world it's practiced. So they impact each other. Shared purpose, both provide a framework for a meaningful life and give adherence to a profound sense of identity and community. Sorry about that. So I think we could agree that culture is a key component impacting society, even though it's made up of individuals. And my thoughts were that we could summarize the word culture into deeply held beliefs and biases. And I bring in biases because human beings always have that cognitive dissonance going on where we look for things naturally to support what we already believe and think. So if we hold an idea, for example, that the government isn't looking after us, we're going to look for more things that will actually support that view. So it's not difficult to see how culture can influence people's voting preferences. Excuse me, just 1 second. I'm going to have to try and help my... So I see someone's in the chat there. No, I've already looked at that. That's okay. So we can see that pervading culture influences how people vote. But what I really want to think about today is how do people in power influence people's preferences, people's culture, in order to encourage them to support them or support an ideology that they want to promote. So let me just double check. So I'm just going to stop that screen share for a second. So this means really that individuals within society, because of human nature, are vulnerable to being influenced, particularly in the society we live in today, with all the internet and social media and all the things that are going on. And of course, this was something that was recognised by this group that were trying to take over the Republican Party. They recognised that, and they started to use those resources of the internet and social media, etc., in order to start to influence society through their culture or their beliefs and their biases, to influence them to vote for them primarily over time. So they would reinforce, using misinformation and disinformation, they would reinforce their biases that they already had about the government being not in their benefit, and they needed to have a radical change, basically. And one of the things that Elder Tess brought up in the Vespers presentation, which I think is worth mentioning again, is she had a real concern for members of the movement, because she didn't want us to be blind to the truth and blinded from culture. In other words, she wanted us to be able to understand how culture and human nature can actually blind us to the truth. And so that was a genuine concern she expressed at the time. And we want to be able to consider what aspects of culture are either consistent with the kingdom of God and those which aren't, because she also taught us that there would be no church state. So this is where we came to understand there's not going to be a Sunday law, how it wasn't anything really to do with Sabbath. It was much more to do with human rights. It was to do with equality, really. And one of the other things that was taught also was understanding radical feminism. This has been something which has progressed from when Elder Tess introduced that to us, which was actually quite a change. It marked a big change from where we had been as conservative Adventists through to where we were heading as a movement. And one of the phrases that was really important was the personal is political. As we became radical feminists, we had to understand what that meant. And one of the key phrases, aside from equality, was the personal is political. And a lot of us understood that to be how we can influence politics through our day-to-day lives, which is true. It can influence society, it influences other people. However, what's even more important perhaps to understand with our current perception of things is how the political is also personal. And it's basically, I'm kind of interchanging here a little, that culture is kind of what's personal. When we're looking at all the definition of those things that impact culture, it's all very personal. And so if you consider that politics can influence culture, it obviously can all influence the personal. So with that in mind, I'm looking at politics and culture and how so I want to look, first of all, I'll share the screen again. I want to look firstly at share my screen. So firstly, I'm going to look at how culture, or in this, I'm thinking of it as our personal, impacts politics, and then I'm going to look at it the other way round. So culture is the invisible framework that dictates how a society functions. It shapes foundational political ideologies and dictates citizens' expectations of government. Obviously, citizens being people who make up society, and determines which policies are deemed acceptable. So key areas where culture impacts politics include ideology and worldview. So those shared traditions, religions, social histories shape what societies value. Prioritising individual liberty versus collective societal welfare. So that's important when we're considering equity and equality. Political participation. Cultural norms dictate whether civic engagement is viewed as an everyday duty or an intimidating top-down endeavour. Policy formation. Cultural values directly drive policy debates, heavily influencing legislation around immigration, education, and human rights. Institutions and trust. Societies with varying cultural tolerances for power, hierarchy, and diversity often experience vastly different levels of political stability and trust. So all of these things are how culture impacts the institutions or how the personal can impact politics. So switching it around and having a look at how politics impacts culture. So politics, this is quicker. Politics shapes culture primarily by setting the rules and allocating resources and defining societal values. Through laws, funding, and public rhetoric, governments directly influence daily behaviour, public attitudes, and creative expression. The relationship works both ways as cultural shifts often inspire and drive new political movements. I mean, we can see recently the government's brought in tax reforms and changes that are going to impact certain people negatively. So you can see how laws will impact individuals within society and society as a whole. And so those are the two things I want us to keep in mind. And when we're looking at those things, we can see how principles or ideologies that differ within an institution. If an institution doesn't hold equality or equity as an important value, then we can see how those laws and rules that are being made that are not taking equality and diversity and equity into account are going to impact people, particularly in certain groups, in a negative way. And this is why it's important to appreciate the difference between the good government versus the bad government, because a lot of that revolves around equality. In other words, you're not just serving some of the people, you're serving all of the people in a good government. A bad government serves themselves and oftentimes a very small subset. In the case of recent examples, you could say the billionaires. They are benefiting more than, say, everyday people. So obviously with culture being so important, or the personal being so important, and for institutions who want to get into power, if you're going to have that seventh kingdom get into power, they needed to be able to influence people, take advantage of their human nature, if you like, and be able to get more support so that they would be able to get power, take power over in what is a democratic country. And so I mentioned it before, the fact that you can use misinformation and disinformation in order to reinforce whatever those preconceived ideas are in society that will encourage the population in general to have a shift where they decide they've had enough of whatever they deem is the status quo, and they're looking for a radical change. And I say radical in the context of something that's going to be, we've looked at radical feminism as being the root of things, which is what that word is from. And I'm going to be looking at that too. So if we look at, first of all, I want to take a look at information warfare, because we just share my screen again. So information warfare, I think most of us are familiar with that term because we're in an information war, and we've been in an information war for a long time. And it's not just impacting the United States, it's impacting the world because we are in a global society, even though nationalism and populism is kind of winning in a lot of areas of the world. You can't really get away from the fact that we are in a global community. And the information warfare impacts the whole of anyone who's really susceptible to or has the internet and social media in particular. So information warfare, it says, is the battle space use and management of information and communication technology to gain a competitive advantage over an adversary. And this is what they've been working at behind the scenes for a long time. And they're still doing the same thing too. It hasn't stopped. It involves offensive and defensive operations. So it's a bit like attacking and protecting, if you like. You can attack or you can protect yourself. So defensive or offensive operations aimed at manipulating information. And that's what they've been working at. disrupting enemy command structures and shaping public perception, often through psychological and cyber-enabled operations. And just, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to move that so fast. So battle space, which is a term that I hadn't sort of heard before, signifies a military theatre of operations. So it is a warfare, definitely, which is interesting. And domains where military competition take place include air, sea, land, etc., cyberspace, the information environment. And key dimensions and capabilities of information warfare include cognitive manipulation, electronic warfare, cyber operations, and military deception. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I want to make sure I'm running out of time and I don't want to go over time. So I just want to say that institutions treat the modern information environment as critical infrastructure because the boundary between civilian digital life, social media, what you do online, and external security has blurred. National military, such as the Australian Defence Force and the US Department of Defence, referred to currently as the Department of War, incorporate information and cyber domains as primary warfighting areas alongside their land, sea, airspace. And you can see that even in the war on Iran. You can see Iran has been using information warfare against the United States with their Lego videos. I don't know if anyone's seen them. Some of them are they're very clever, actually. And they're really using that against the United States. So a society that's upset with how government is functioning will be a lot easier to influence when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. Remember, it's human nature that we look for information that's going to already reinforce what we already believe. So this is what is going to be, is what they're going to use when they're talking about the misinformation and the disinformation. And when we look back over time, we can see that this has happened. I think in the movement, because it was brought up to us, because we were given eyes to see it, had we, prior to that, we were susceptible to it, very susceptible to it. And we probably would have been on totally the wrong side of most things because of that. And so this is why it's important now that we can see these things and understand them. I'm not expecting everyone to read that. That's more my notes. But so when they were trying to take over, and I'm just getting back down to radical here, when they were trying to take over the government, they were keen to influence society to support them, enable them to get into power. And so they were happy to embellish things, in other words, add to the truth or confuse the truth or just make up things altogether. And when this brought about people who were ready to make a radical change. It's a similar process that's unfolding in Australia. Not that that's prophetically hugely significant compared to the glorious land. However, from a perspective of the worldwide Sunday law, it's probably very relevant. And we can see that, as I mentioned earlier, that Hanson and Trump have been compared in articles as being very similar in their ideology. So when we look at the word radical, we know that the word comes from the Latin word radix. I'm not expecting everyone to read all this, by the way. I'm just summarising. So, I'm just getting down to the fact that everyday language describes something that is sweeping, drastic, or causes great change. And this is where I think people have been prepared to vote for someone like Trump because they wanted some sort of shift in government that would potentially start to serve the people. That's what the people wanted. However, what they wanted and what they got were two different things. We know that Trump, at the end of the sixth, was a good government and was, to a degree, serving the people and giving them some of the things that they wanted, which was in part why, I guess, so many people voted for Trump again in 2024. However, what they got this time was quite different to what they got in 2016. And that's because of that, the change in powers that were given, the extra power that was given to that seat, and also the fact that they are now really getting to the core of their ideology, which is really serving themselves. And I saw Curtis associated the Republican Party in Congress as being those 10 horns that are assisting or ruling with that king in that period of time. So I thought that was an interesting perspective as well. So in politics, radical refers to a person or idea that advocates for rapid, fundamental, and sometimes extreme changes in societal, economic, and government structures. So extreme changes in society, economic, government structures. Now, the last thing I want to take a look at is the Seventh Kingdom and the hegemonic culture, because this is a part of recognising what's going on, and I thought it was an interesting perspective. So hegemony is not a word that's used often, at least not by myself, and I had to sort of become more familiar with the term. And so what they've done they were intending to, but I don't know how their perception is. But from us looking in, we can see that the Republican Party and the drastic changes that have occurred within that party, which caused them to choose Trump and to place him in that position, is basically they created a hegemonic culture. Hegemony refers to the dominance, leadership, or predominant influence of one group, state, or culture over others. It involves the power to guide, direct, or control, typically characterized by a combination of political, economic, military, and cultural superiority. So the concept's widely used across different contexts to explain power dynamics. I think that's an important point. It's to do with the dynamics of power, how power impacts society in a way. International relations and politics, in this context, it refers to political, economic, and military predominance of one nation, the hegemon, over other states. A hegemonic nation holds enough power to dictate or significantly influence global or regional rules, trade terms, and foreign policies. And we've seen this in Trump's second term and how he's attempting to really influence and control the world and basically use his position as head of the United States to pretty much see himself as head of the world. So historical examples, it says, the influence of ancient Greek city-states, the British Empire, or the global influence of the United States, which has been a global influence for quite some time. Sociology and cultural studies, so popularised by Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, cultural hegemony refers to how a ruling class can manipulate the value system and more of a society through thoroughly, I've obviously got some typos there, that their specific worldview becomes accepted as norm. In other words, it impacts society through that value system. So this is a breakdown of how it works. Instead of relying entirely on force or coercion, the ruling group maintains dominance by creating consent. Their ideologies, laws, and cultural expectations are absorbed by the public as common sense or natural. In other words, they're influencing culture, they're influencing what individuals believe. And the core meaning is dominance and control. This is hegemony, derives from the Greek word hegemonia, meaning to lead. And common synonyms are dominance, supremacy, ascendancy, and authority. So, just going to stop screen. I'm nearly coming to the end of this. So, and I'm aware of the fact that I'm run out of time pretty much. So, we're seeing a lot of Trump supporters regretting their choice to vote for them into office. So, it's interesting that we can see that, because how he was perceived prior and what he's been doing since have been two different things. So there are still a lot of supporters who really make excuses, and I think this is the cognitive dissonance. They don't want to think, well, how could we be so wrong? No, clearly Trump has a plan. Trump's doing things because he's so clever. He's doing things that will bring about what they actually voted him in for, even though currently all the signs are saying, well, no, he hasn't. Cost of living's gone up. Everything's gotten worse. Back at war now, which he promised not to do. So, they make excuses, basically. So, as we said, we understand hegemony, and that seems to be their way of ruling. And this is impacting geopolitics as well as cultural norms within society. And it's impacting the glorious land, the United States, but it's also impacting the world through this spread of ideology and this hegemonic culture. So just as an example, this is an example I found, which I thought was interesting. It says, widespread acceptance that certain career paths, as an example, beauty standards or economic systems are just the way things are. In other words, how they should be, when in reality, they were shaped by a dominant cultural group to maintain a status quo. So basically, we can see, looking back, how these people who are now in power have literally worked through society using culture and using individuals to the point now where they're removing equality and equity principles and laws when you're looking at things like rolling back abortion, the rights of abortion and things like that, and how they're coming out to attack the LGBTQ, in particular trans community. So it's these increase in presidential powers that's enabled this Republican Party to really implement this hegemonic culture. And we're also still seeing an exponential increase in that social unrest, which is really what we're witnessing with the Seventh Kingdom in full swing, pretty much. So just to close, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the movement. As individuals in the movement, it's our belief or our understanding about prophecy that collectively forms our culture in the movement. Our culture within the movement's impacted by our institution, those who are in positions of power, who are teaching and giving messages. That impacts how we see things. And we're learning more about the differences between the government that Lucifer was proposing that was better than God's government. But we can see, as we look at the Seventh Kingdom, how Lucifer's government ends up. And as a movement, our culture is to create an institution that stands in opposition to that we can see is reflecting God's government and God's principles. And even though we're a world, and I think it's good that we are a worldwide movement, because that incorporates a global society, and we have our own views on equality and equity, which is our cultural perspective, radical feminism and all of that. And this is what we as a movement, this is what I've come to understand. So what I'm sharing is my understanding to date of what recently we've been learning, the fact that we are to represent God's good government compared to Lucifer's bad government. And so with that, I'll close in prayer, and I apologise for going over. And obviously, if there are any questions or comments, we can leave those till a later time. It's not important right now. So if you would like to kneel and pray or bow your heads, that'd be good. Thank you. Dear God in heaven, we thank you again for this opportunity to come together to review recent studies, to review older studies, to see how they've all been working together to bring us to the point where we're at now. We've been slow. We still probably are very slow at understanding, and we ask for special insight from the Holy Spirit to be able to see and understand what it is you would have us as a movement to be able to present ideologies that are consistent with your government. And we thank you again for the blessings, the many blessings that you pour out upon your people. And we pray for ongoing understanding as we're moving forward. And we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.